Keir Starmer, and in this video I wanted to look at his first 100 days. I wanted to go a bit deeper and make comparisons between Starmer, previous Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair, and another left-winger, Franklin Delano Roosevelt of America, who had serious issues to deal with when becoming president, some of which were similar to Starmer's issues. And we're going to break this first 100 days down to 3 parts. We're going to look at their legislation, we're going to look at how they dealt with crises, and we're going to have a look at the impact of their actions. Tony Blair is a fitting comparison for Starmer because he too was a Labour leader, entered Downing Street in '97, and he had a new Labour agenda aimed with blending social justice with economic liberalism, somewhat similar in my opinion to what Starmer's doing. The socio-economic issues he faced, healthcare reform, education modernisation, and a need for political reform, mirror some of the challenges that Starmer has today. Franklin D. Roosevelt provides another compelling comparison. Although Roosevelt governed the United States, he faced monumental crises similar to those today in the UK. Economic instability, unemployment, isolationism, and a widespread demand for structural reforms. Starmer, like FDR, must confront an economic downturn, though his challenges also include managing Brexit, so isolationism, high immigration, and the UK's housing crisis. Roosevelt's New Deal brought transformative government interventions, providing a framework to examine Starmer's more conservative approach to economic reform. So, how did each leader use laws to fix their problems? When FDR took office in 1933, the US was facing the worst economic collapse in its history. Unemployment was at a jaw-dropping 25%. That's 1 in 4 Americans without a job, and they're desperate for work. Even those fortunate enough to be employed faced drastic pay cuts and instability. Across the country, an estimated 9,000 banks had gone under, and that meant savings had evaporated. People was now sticking their money underneath mattresses, as opposed to putting it in banks, and that was causing more instability. More than a third of US families were living in poverty, very similar to what the UK has today, while farmers, who made up nearly 25% of the workforce, saw their crop prices plummet to a point where it was unsellable as produce. In fact, they even preferred to burn it as fuel. There are accounts of people saying that the countryside smelled of popcorn because it was more energy efficient and financially efficient to burn it than sell it. The nightmare that he'd actually inherited was a result of over-speculation, deregulation, and neoliberal policies like laissez-faire capitalism. Banks gambled away funds on risky investments, with the stock market speculation leading to the 1929 crash, and that erased trillions in value overnight. Income inequality was extreme. By the end of Hoover's term, that's the previous president, the top 1% owned 40% of the wealth, while wages for the average worker stagnated. Again, very similar to the situation that Starmer has inherited. And what did he do to fix this crisis? He passed large numbers of major reformative legislation, 15 major laws in total in the first 100 days. On his second day of office, he ordered banks to go on holiday to stop the panic that was taking place. This act actually stabilized the banking system by allowing only financially sound banks to reopen. Within days, Americans began to redeposit their savings, and it restored confidence in the banks. He created a public works administration and a thing called the Civilian Conservation Corps, and it was designed to create jobs in the United States for infrastructure and conservation projects. So they're building roads and bridges and schools, but also parks and forests and protecting land. But he also passed legislation to protect farmers and their farming prices. He also brought in groundbreaking law that created a thing called the FDIC to ensure bank deposits are protected in case of collapses, to prevent another 1929 crash. And he even built dams known as the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, not to be mistaken with Marvel. But the idea was to build electricity that was renewable and everlasting for America at a cheap price. And the impact of this? Well, it was considerable. Unemployment dropped by 10%, GDP grew by about 9%, and that was just in his first 4 years. Millions of jobs were created, infrastructure had been revitalized, and American faith in the future was rekindled. In Blair's first 100 days, he put in a number of significant changes that modernized the British political landscape. That was about being inclusive and more democracy. For example, the House of Lords, he put in a new law that basically ended a centuries-old tradition by reducing the number of hereditary peers He brought in two devolution acts, that's the Scotland Act and the Wales Act, and that created a Scottish Parliament and a Welsh Assembly, now known as the Senedd. He also brought in the Human Rights Act, which basically brought in the ECHR, the European Convention for Human Rights, into British law. It meant we didn't have to go to Strasbourg anymore to sort out our issues. But there was also the beginnings of the Good Friday Agreement, not realised within the 100 days, but during that period it was pretty pivotal in trying to readdress the issues of what had been taking place in Ireland. As for Starmer, as a comparison, it's not been as prolific. Starmer has been more cautious in his approach and focused on stabilising the economy and addressing immediate issues, due in part to discovering that there was a $22 billion deficit left over by the previous government. As a result, a number of costly projects have now been halted, but other things have been introduced, such as a National Wealth Fund to invest in green infrastructure in a move to produce long-term sustainable energy, whilst also addressing climate change. In terms of other energy policies, they've also set up the Great British Energy, a state-owned company aimed at clean energy production, with a broader aim of trying to hit net zero goals. There was also a rail nationalisation bill bringing railways under public ownerships after contracts expire, making a significant move towards state-controlled infrastructure. As mentioned with Blair and the Good Friday Agreement, I thought it was valuable to also state they have attempted to pass legislation for workers' rights and also with housing and protecting renters, as well as cancelling the Rwanda plan and introducing population-based housing targets as well as funds for housing. In the final part, I wanted to focus on communication, as I've seen the ability of FDR and Blair, whereas with Starmer it appears to be a bit of a weakness. So for example, FDR inherited the country in turmoil. To calm the American public and rebuild trust, he turned to the radio, and that medium reached 60% of households. That's about 50 million Americans at once. And he explained complex policies like the Emergency Banking Act. And by putting complicated policy into plain language, he turned the abstract threat of economic collapse into a shared challenge that everyone could understand and combat. And it's arguable his approach to communication was transformative, in a way unprecedented, as he made Americans feel directly included in his government's, his New Deal's mission. What about Blair? Well, when he took office, he faced a media landscape dominated by tabloids and 24-hour news. His communications team, led by Alastair Campbell, revolutionised media engagement, understanding the importance of setting and controlling the news agenda. Blair's team was so media-focused, it had 300 press officers on staff by 1999, operating at a scale previously unseen in British politics. Alastair Campbell's approach was all about managing perception. For instance, when Blair introduced the minimum wage in 1998, Campbell orchestrated media appearances and press conferences across the country to emphasise the policy's popularity and economic necessity. However, this focus on spin came with criticism, and by the early 2000s, 76% of the British people felt Blair's government was too focused on media management over substance. Starmer, in contrast, has grappled with the media's portrayal of his leadership. The right-wing press has repeatedly highlighted the policy missteps, such as the winter fuel allowance controversy, where critics framed his decision as out of touch and punitive towards the vulnerable. Starmer's perceived lack of coherent media strategy has left him on the defensive, with public narratives largely shaped by the press, rather than his own team. And this leads on to Starmer's approach to social media, which has been more reserved and reactive compared to leaders like Blair, who dominated traditional media, and FDR, who mastered direct radio communication as well as poster campaigns. His social media strategy has been criticised for missing opportunities to set the agenda. Instead of using his platforms, which have the biggest numbers in social media, they haven't connected and mobilised younger audiences, which was seen in the vote turnout, or countered narratives effectively by the right-wing press. His team frequently responds to issues after they've gained traction, which can make his leadership appear reactive and out of touch. One telling statistic, 60% of Britons surveyed after the winter fuel policy announcement felt the government was not doing enough to address the cost of living crisis. Blair and FDR confronted their respective national crises with ambitious reforms that reshaped their countries. FDR's New Deal provided relief, recovery and reform during a period of unparalleled economic hardship, while Blair's modernisation agenda sought to democratise British institutions and enhance social welfare. In contrast, Starmer's approach has been cautious, focusing on private investment and economic stability rather than direct interventions in housing, social welfare, or regional autonomy. While his stance may reflect his unique challenges of Brexit and emigration, and the housing crisis and the cost of living crisis, the lingering effects of the recent Conservative policies, it remains to be seen whether his strategy can deliver the profound changes needed to address the UK's pressing issues. Once again, thank you so much for listening and getting to the end of this video, and if you've gotten this far, I must have done something right, so please hit that like and subscribe button. And to those who already support the channel, my patrons and YouTube members, thank you so much. You really keep this channel going and growing. Once again, thanks for listening. Bye for now.